a meeting on this subject, but what I'm going to do is just talk about the subject of mining in general and the Gama Valley in central Tibet in particular, on the basis of my own travels in rural Tibet, on what friends from Gama and other parts of the country have told me over the years, and on interviews which I conducted with newcomers from Tibet between 2005 and 2009 for Human Rights Watch. So first of all, I'll make some general observations about the subject, and then go on to talk about Gama in a little bit more detail. So I suppose the first point to make really is that the deposits of minerals in Tibet are not huge and not eminently economically extractable by global standards. The environment is very harsh and the people are regarded as hostile, and so the prospects for Chinese domestic mining companies are not as attractive as might initially be thought, and it took a long time, decades of Chinese occupation, for the process of mining to really get underway. But the thing to understand is that because of state investment in infrastructure and preferential policies, it has become profitable for small and medium domestic companies in the most recent period. There are no environmental safety costs, there's a strong security environment, and there are many factors which make it in the short term, for some fairly small-scale operations, an attractive proposition. Now, the state is ready to do this and to provide these facilities because industrial development and closer economic integration with the mainland are long-term goals of Tibet policy. And the funds available for infrastructure development since 2000 in the Tibet Autonomous Region, which is already very rich in government subsidies, were absolutely enormous. And one could even include in this cost the cost of the resettlement and the rehousing projects which are now going on all over Tibet, since one of the objectives of nomad resettlement and so-called comfortable housing for villagers is to concentrate rural dwellers in semi-urban centers and take them off pasture land that the state might want to use for other purposes, like mining. Anyway, in the case of central Tibet, since the upgrade of the Qinghai-Xizang highway and the construction of the railway in 2006, small to medium-scale mining operations have proliferated in central Tibet. Local people are often unable to say exactly what it is that's being mined in any particular place, but usually it's precious and semi-precious metal ores and a variety of industrial minerals. Anyway, they may be small operations by the standards of the industry, but their impact on the local environment is absolutely extreme, poisoning the water, spoiling pasture and farmland, causing cattle death and human illness. Occasionally, local people will be able to get work associated with the mines, which would usually be limited to truck transport, but generally the mining operations are run and staffed by Chinese, and local people are excluded. No royalties are paid to local communities, and it's frequently alleged that local officials accept bribes to smooth the way for mining operations on their turf. The relocation of farming and pastoral settlements is also very common. For these reasons, local grievances against mining became the leading cause of protest in Tibet in the period since 2000. This was a period in which public protest had been eliminated effectively by a very pervasive security regime based on surveillance and intimidation, in which all forms of protest were construed as political. In this highly restrictive climate, local people attempted to oppose mining on the grounds that their grievances, such as poisoned water, dead livestock, and official corruption, should be accepted as non-political, just as such grievances are in mainland China. Protests often took the form of petitions to the township or county government, at least initially, and in several known cases were actually led by village and township government officials. We do not know of any case in which such petitions were entertained. Petitioners are given a blunt and familiar message, which is Sa Gun Chenta, Nam Gun Chenta. The land belongs to the state, and the air you breathe. And opposing what the state has approved counts as political dissent, which carries a very high penalty. What we're talking about here, for those who are not familiar with the Maoist system, is what are called antagonistic or non-antagonistic contradictions among the people. In the case of any sort of social dispute or movement or protest, it's always up to the party to decide whether this is a contradiction which is antagonistic or non-antagonistic, and if it's deemed to be non-antagonistic, then it can be dealt with in a sort of civil way rather than being totally crushed. So Tibetan protesters, villagers often understand, feel that it's very much within their rights to protest over things like poisoned water without it being construed as political. So that's what we're talking about here. And there is some difference between state-owned mining companies and private entrepreneurs. The latter case are known to make ad hoc compensation payments to local people to curtail further protests, whereas state-owned mining companies tend to be invulnerable to that kind of pressure. There have been reported instances of mass protest and even violence where milder forms of protest have failed, as happened over the mining at Sharatlatse in Minya in eastern Tibet in 2007, Mankam and Gama in 2009. That also happened in Peiyu, Dege Peiyu in 2010, in the Mu Valley in western Tibet in early 2011. These are some of the examples that we know about. There are other such reports that have never been confirmed, and no doubt other such incidents which were never even widely reported. Popular protests against mining indicate the growing immediacy of socio-economic grievances in an era of intensified development activity. But they might also represent a pragmatic adaptation to single-issue protests that cannot easily be dismissed as separatism. In this sense, Tibetan protest has started to converge with mainland China, where popular protest against land dispossession, pollution, and so on saw huge growth in the same period. Despite the best attempts of local officials in Tibet to brand such protests as political, in line with the general policy of the zero tolerance for Tibetan dissent, provincial level leaderships have found this a little bit more difficult. In TAR, for example, in addition to crushing protests, the party also began to issue laws and regulations for the control of mining, giving the impression that only unauthorized operators are responsible for damaging the environment and ignoring local concerns. And in some instances, like the protests at Gold and Silver Mountain in Mankam in 2009, June, the regional leadership seemed to lose its nerve a little bit and attempted to broker an agreement between the miners and the locals, thus acknowledging legitimate grievances. So, despite the prevailing repression in Tibet and the party's commitment to outlawing all forms of dissent, there is a little space for political initiative on issues that concern daily welfare and the prosperity of the masses, as these are construed by the Communist Party. And this has been illustrated recently by a few examples, such as the positive response that the TAR government gave to protests over graduate unemployment. So mining is very much an issue that sort of straddles that divide, really. So those are the general observations that I would make initially. Concerning Gama Valley, well, with the state vigorously pursuing industrial development and economic integration as its long-term solution for Tibet, and characterizing any complaint as political dissent or splitism, can you hear me? Yeah. Or splitism, mining has proliferated even in densely populated agricultural regions. If mining were to be at all restricted or rationalized on normal grounds, as it is in other parts of the world, such as environmental damage to sedentary rural communities in populated areas, the historic Gama Valley, which is 60 kilometers upstream from Lhasa, should be among the first to qualify. But the area happens to have some of the largest copper deposits in Tibet, and exploitation of these already began in about 1990. Much before the present wave of mining activity that we see today in central Tibet. Even before that, there was a cement factory in the lower valley, which was quite unusual at that time. And there were protests even, back at that time against the construction of a power station, and more protests came in the following years. By the early 2000s, there was concern among local people about the poisoning of water supplies and the spoiling of pasture and farmland. And petitions were reportedly presented to the township and or the county governments at that time. And in some cases, the mining company actually paid compensation per head, on a per-head basis for poisoned cattle, of which there were hundreds, according to local people. The situation seems to have developed somewhat from about 2006, when geologists from mainland China and regional government officials visited the valley to conduct further exploration. This resulted in an expansion of the project and the development of other significant deposits in the neighboring valleys of Medro and Zhigung. These events were presumably related to the completion of the railway line to Lhasa that year. The mining company also apparently at that time agreed to subsidize vehicles for local households and give them work transporting the ore, and that's sort of the first concession really that was ever made to the interests of local people. We also learned that at least one village in Lower Zhigung had marched to the county government offices, that's Medjugorje County, the county government offices that summer, led by the village leader, to present a petition against mining development. That village leader was arrested and later fired from his job, and the villagers were sent away with a scolding. This is one of several unconfirmed reports of village leaders being arrested for such protests. Then in 2009, the Gama mine was acquired by China Gold, which is a big league Canada-based company that promised to boost investment in the project. Again, it would seem to the simple observer like myself that railway access is what really allowed and facilitated this expansion. And Gama is actually the first of Tibet's high-value deposits to actualize the potential of the new infrastructure. The others are waiting for it. The other big deposits are Shetongme in Shigatse and the Yulong mine in Jondan. They're still waiting for, to be connected to significant infrastructure like railway access, to really take off in the way that Gama is taking off now. At the same time, a massive hydroelectric project is under construction on the Kichu River, immediately upstream of the mining area. The Kichu has now been dammed just above the confluence with the Zhigung Valley, and a series of further dams upstream is planned. Dozens of villages are being relocated as a result. Officials claim that it will improve electricity supply in rural areas and bring more land under irrigation and prevent flooding. It seems more likely that the nearby mining operations will be the main beneficiaries of the power generation. But in the long term, the plan is to extend the Lhasa urban area upriver, starting with the construction of more housing, industrial parks, possibly even an airport. And all of this needs power too. The worst anti-mining protest in Gama so far took place in June of 2009. Fighting broke out between villagers over the diversion of a river to the mining site, and 3 locals were seriously injured. The next day, villagers approached some regional officials who had come to investigate the incident with a petition calling for the mines to be closed, as they poisoned rivers, killed livestock, spoiled productive land, and caused illness. This petition was rejected, and villagers were warned by local officials that further protest would be treated as a political offense. The Gama Valley was sealed off by security forces for weeks afterwards. The mining company also withdrew at that time its former offer of employment and vehicle subsidies for locals, following this incident. So that was the very heavy-handed response of the state at that time. Since that time, investment in the Gama mines has been stepped up. And last year it was announced that 5 of the 13 groups of villages in the valley will have to be relocated. Those villagers pleaded that they didn't want to leave Gama and be sent elsewhere, and so they are going to be accommodated on the empty land of other villages, which is going to make things rather crowded. And some have already been given land at a place called Kokang in the lower valley, which is the site of a former cement factory and a toxic wasteland. Officially sanctioned research, by the way, on water quality in the Gama River, conducted by a joint Scandinavian and Tibetan team, was published in an international scientific journal in 2010, and it showed dangerously high levels of heavy metals in the surface water in the valley. Now, the reason that I wanted to talk about Gama today is that it's been in the official media very recently. Tibet Daily reported that on the 23rd of March, Wu Yingjie, who is one of the top party leaders in the autonomous region, made an inspection tour of the 3 main mining sites in the county. It's quite rare to find media coverage of events like this, especially told in frank terms, which is why I've decided to share it with you today. It's quite exciting when you actually sort of get below the surface of how the leadership and the elite works in Tibet. So rather unexpectedly, Wu Yingjie scolded the mining company officials and local government officials for not doing enough to ensure that mining, quote, enriches the masses, that environmental standards are observed, and that the relocation of villagers is handled properly. I don't think they were expecting to hear that exactly. The background to this story is that the TAR has been on a high security alert since January of this year, due to the wave of protests in eastern Tibet and tension over the upcoming anniversaries in March. And the regional party has been stacking up the pressure on cadres and officials, particularly to maintain social stability, as they call it. Officials down to the lowliest village heads and enterprise bosses are allocated so-called clear responsibilities for maintaining social stability, and some have been fired during the most recent period for not being vigilant enough, to make an example to the rest. Maintaining social stability, Tinling Sungkyong is how they phrase it in the official lexicon. Maintaining social stability in the rest of the world, we would probably characterize this as preemptive repression. That means making sure that protest is crushed before it even happens, and persistently re-educating people so that they don't protest in the first place. So there has been a crisis around maintaining social stability in the last couple of months, and that is the background to Wu Yingjie's visit to Gama. So according to the media report, Wu Yingjie told his hosts that enrichment of the community was a priority, that they had to handle the relocation of villagers sensitively and accommodate the lawful and just demands of the local public. Lawful and just demands of the local public. He politely commended the county leaders, but then went on to warn them, and I'm quoting here, during the mining period, there must be strict adherence to the view of scientific development and to the spirit of the Fifth Tibet Work Forum, so that deposits are not arbitrarily exploited each and everywhere, even leading to fighting in every village. We must resolutely follow the path of scientific planning, unifying forces, and concentrating development, end quote. For those who don't know, scientific development is the name of the particular ideology that is associated with Hu Jintao. Every great general secretary is supposed to have their own ideological corpus, and that's Hu Jintao's. And the Fifth Tibet Work Forum is a meeting that was held in Beijing by the central government in 2010. I think we're not exactly sure what it decided and what the spirit of the conference was, but I think the remarks here are referring to the scientific and professional nature of government operations, and that things have to be managed in a scientific way or something like that. But just listen to those words again in Tibetan. This is very strong language for a party leader to be using in public. So it looks like the regional party flexing its muscles here and warning the miners and local officials to clean up their act. There is an emergency on to maintain social stability in advance of the big party congress later this year, and their behavior is provoking grievances among local people that the party might just decide are legitimate. So there are policies and laws on environmental protection, and on improving mass living standards. And under present circumstances, the party might just decide to enforce them. Wu's very frank remarks have been published in the party newspaper, probably to send a signal more widely through the system. In this encounter, I think, we can see some of the tensions which are at play in current Tibet policy. Industries like mining are central to the long-term development of the region and non-negotiable. But the so-called contradictions that they cause must be carefully managed by the authorities. This may involve reining in corruption at the local level or obliging mining companies to take on higher operating costs to meet their social responsibilities. But nothing more than that seems very likely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I suggest that before the second speaker gives his presentation, if there are any comments or questions,